Next up is Marcus SWANEPOEL. He's the co-founder and CEO of Luno, and you'll be speaking how a new global cryptocurrency will impact consumers across Africa.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon, for that. I'm always amazed, if you're in the industry for a couple of years, you tend to forget about the Satoshi white paper and all the really cool things that have happened in the industry, and it's just always a nice reminder to think how far the industry's actually come. I think this is the clicker, right? Okay, great. So just quick intro. I'm one of the co-founders of Luno. We are a cryptocurrency company now operating in about 7 offices around the world in London, Singapore, Lagos, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. We have customers in about 40 countries, about 2.5 million of those customers, and we're a team of just over 200 based across all of these countries. And really just make it easy for people to buy and sell and store and use cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. But today, I'm not going to talk about Luno. I'm going to talk more about the industry and what the opportunity is for Africa. And I think before I start, I want everyone just to think back to the year 1996, because it's a very important year for many reasons that you'll soon discover. But just think back, where were you in 1996? Because I can remember I was in high school. I was in Standard 8. Actually, Simon was in the same school. He was in Standard 9. And in Gauteng, I was sitting there. So it was a very important year for many reasons. And one of them was that was the year that former President Thabo Mbeki spoke about, he did this fantastic speech about I am an African, which spoke about the beginning of the African Renaissance. And this concept of the African Renaissance was actually something that he borrowed from Sheikh Anta Diop, who's a Senegalese, and he started writing essays about the African Renaissance in 1946 already. The ideas were already starting to culminate. And even before him, he worked to some extent on the work of Marcus Garvey, who was Jamaican-born. He was in the US, and he was an activist, and Martin Luther King was someone that really looked up to him. And he came up with this concept of the United States of Africa. So these are all intellectual heavyweights in terms of thinking about Africa and moving Africa forward and bringing Africa together. And a lot of the stuff that they spoke about was around obvious things like individuality and freedom of expression and dignity and human rights. But there was something else that binded them all together if you read their texts and what they wrote about. And that thing was, they all realized that human progress is largely driven by collaboration, consolidation, and economies of scale. Right? There's a lot of complexity to that concept, but they knew that if people, for society to come together, people tend to move together and pull together. And we see this in many, many different forms. We see it firstly in the creation of nation states. That's why we went from villages to creating states, first for defense, later to pool resources. We see this happening with people moving to cities, the large urbanization rates, everyone getting together, starting to specialize in things, bringing all that brain power, intellectual power together. You see it with multinationals, big companies being built like Facebook and Google. You see it even in operating systems that we use on our phones. Everything is congregating to iOS and Android. There's many, many examples of all areas in life where people tend to come together and build things together and try and bring the cost down. And what's important that they recognize and that we believe is that this is really part of human nature. We can't help ourselves. We want to get together. We want to bring all of these things together, and it's an inevitable path to development of society. So they recognize this as part of their thinking around the African Renaissance. And the important point of that is that money is no exception. Money is also inevitably going to consolidate, if not already. And I'll show you some data points on what exactly I mean by that. If you see in the bottom corner there, that's a little pink block. And that is just to represent today's fiat currency system, which is governments typically issuing their own money. And that's only been happening really in the way we know it now for about 40 or 50 years. Now, just out of interest, what a lot of people don't know is there's a lot of currency unions already, right? So there's a lot of countries that actually adopt the same currencies, or where you can use the same currencies, and that's just a map of where similar currencies or currency unions exist. So there's already some consolidation in the market. It's not as fragmented as people think. But when you take a step back and you think about the Coinage Act that was passed in 1792 in the US, and that was the first time that someone issued government money, at that time linked to gold. So that's actually not that long ago, and it's still a very small part of history. But if you zoom out even more, and that's that pink block to 600 BC, if that whole block represents time, since 600 BC, humans actually use some kind of metal, in particular gold. I know there was also silver. There were some other substances and materials that people used, but largely over the last few thousand years, we've had something, either a currency linked to gold, as the US dollar was in the Coinage Act, or gold being used in coins or some derivative of it. So what's important to know here is that for most of humanity's existence, we have effectively worked on a global financial system and a consolidated financial system. And so humanity will always tend to trend back towards how do we consolidate money, how do we get the economies of scale. And I'll explain now why this is important and what the impact is when this happens. Of course, we have two very recent experiments or projects that also show the value of this: the United States with the US dollar and the euro coming together. And again, when people want to work together and they want to consolidate their thinking, they want to bring their resources together, money becomes an integral part of that because it's an integral part of trade and transacting with each other. So what if we had a universal financial system for Africa? Let's maybe forget about cryptocurrency for a moment, or Ethereum, or all those other things. Let's just conceptually think, what would that mean for Africa? And on the right, I created a little bit of a barometer that will go up every time we can put a value to it. And so I'm going to quickly run through a couple of areas. We've got the obvious ones, remittances. The remittance market this year will probably be about $40 billion. The fees on that, sometimes people say 20%, some people say it's 5%. It's actually gone down to about, on average, 10%. So let's call that roughly $4 billion worth of value that if people were transacting in a way that wasn't, that, for example, everyone was using the same financial system and you didn't have to convert currencies, you would at the very least get that. And that doesn't even incorporate a lot of inter-Africa trade. It doesn't incorporate like business-to-business payments. So the number is probably 10, 20, maybe even 100 times bigger than that. E-commerce. The e-commerce market is said to be about $30 billion in a couple of years. And again, the fees on that, when you transact, is also going into the billions per year. And if you think about it, it's a little bit, in some sense, ridiculous that, you know, if you go back in time about 30 or 40, well, not even, let's say 20 or 30 years, when you go to a store and you buy something with cash, there's no one that takes a cut of that transaction. That's a transaction between you and the person standing there or the business owner standing there. So we've gravitated into a world where we're all transacting with each other and with other third parties, but everyone's taking a cut of the payments. And the thing is, it feels so small, you don't feel the pain, right? It appears so small that it's like 20 cents here, 1 rand there, 5 rand there. So you don't feel the pain. But actually, if you add this up to your over the course of your lifetime, the number becomes quite big. And if you add this number up for the entire society, it becomes an astronomically big number. I'll give some other examples. Interoperability, we've spoken about before at one of the previous conferences. It's very hard to put a number on that, but everyone agrees that the more interoperable the financial system becomes, the more value gets unlocked. There's studies done on capital controls and again, this can be debatable, but you know, some of the studies say that if capital controls are relaxed in Africa, inter-Africa trade can increase by over 50%. And then we have identity theft and cybercrime. And again, that number includes, it's a very broad definition of that. But within that category, there's things like identity theft. So if you use certain technologies like credit cards, you're a lot more susceptible to identity theft. Where you use things like cryptocurrency, that becomes less of a risk. So there's value to be created there as well. Then we have the stable currency that Simon spoke about in Venezuela. Every country doesn't have this issue, but in Africa, many countries have stability issues with their currencies. They have very high inflation, so there's a number we could put on that. I tried to calculate it, it was too difficult. But we know it's a big number. And then there's a whole bunch of other things, and that list actually comes from studies done on the euro and a common currency that was created for euro. What was the impact, the positive impact? Things like price transparency, cross-border employment, simplified billing, expanding market opportunities, more financial and macroeconomic stability, lower interest rates, and that's an enormous one, by the way, because you have these economies of scale, you can do lower interest rates for everyone. And structural reform in the case of some countries that have to comply with certain standards to be part of that union. So the point here is I'm not trying to put an actual number on it, because we don't know what that number is. But I hope you can all see that if we look at previous experiments like the European Union and certainly the US and what a common monetary union and currency has done for them, the impact is absolutely enormous. We are talking trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, and remember, we're not talking about 1 year, we're talking about generations of people, 30 years, 100 years. That's all the money that's actually being lost in the system at the moment. So what happens with all of that value? Where does it all go? If we manage to consolidate everything together, it's like a big pizza, but the exciting thing about the internet and the technology industry is all of this value, or most of this value, will all go to consumers. It's not like these existing players in the industry, like banks and payment companies and remittance companies, and then we build this new financial system or this global currency, and then you just basically replace all of those players with other people who just take the same fees from everyone else. If you look at the internet, what the internet did, Google coming in, Facebook and so on, they really made it free or cheap for most services. You don't have to buy postage stamps anymore. You don't have to wait for mail anymore. You can use Skype for free over the internet. Doesn't mean all of those old services become redundant. You still can use landlines and you can still use the mail if you want to. But a big chunk of the economy, all of that value actually just goes straight to consumers, and then there's a small sliver that still goes to companies that are involved in providing services and products to people, but the pie is a lot smaller for them, and there's generally a lot less of those companies. So there's a bigger concentration of power and that we see with, again, companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google now. Okay, so it's a net positive to society, and the numbers are absolutely astronomical. Now, why do we think cryptocurrency specifically is the answer to building a common monetary union, given how important the benefits are to society? This is probably a 2-hour presentation in itself, but just at a very high level, I think one of the issues with common currencies and unions is political will. It's very difficult to build these things if governments and people are struggling to come together to do it. And in Africa, this has been one of the issues. This idea of the United States of Africa has been around for a very long time. The African Union have started doing things around it. There's been talks about a common currency for a very long time. But it's not really happening, and it's because the political will isn't really there for various reasons. It has to do with many things, like some countries being stronger than others, a lot of risk around some of the smaller countries or where there's conflict, and so the incentives aren't really there. So we think that if this is going to happen, it's going to come from a grassroots level. It's going to come from, where Simon said, if there's enough people that want something to happen, it is going to happen. Whether the governments or whether the politicians or whoever's in charge want it to happen, at the end of the day, it's what people want. So we believe a common currency is going to come from a grassroots level. And why would it be crypto? Because it has certain inherent characteristics that makes it easier to come from a grassroots level. Most importantly, it's open. Anyone can use it. Anyone can innovate on it. It's to a large extent neutral. I know this is a little bit debatable if you think about who owns the mining and depending on which currency, but to a large extent it's neutral. So it's a lot easier to coordinate between countries and say, look, we're not saying the rand is better than the shilling, or we're not trying to have a fight between this country or that country. We're just saying, here's this neutral thing that we all can use, and there's no debate about who's doing it better or who's doing it worse. Very importantly, in the case of Africa, it's auditable. So as you know, for most cryptocurrencies, you can see all the transactions on the blockchain. You can see where the money's going. So there's a lot of transparency. And when it comes to things like corruption, that is potentially a very interesting aspect that will drive this forward in Africa. A couple of other things. It's trustless. This is kind of a general one that we all know about. In many cases, it's more secure than the existing financial system. And very importantly, cryptocurrencies are very versatile, because it's going to be very difficult to say, this is the one thing that we're going to have going forward, and that will be that forever. It's highly unlikely that there will be one currency or just one way to think about it. It's the same with operating systems. It gravitates towards 2 or 3 players. So the versatility means it could be something like Bitcoin, it could be something like Ethereum, It could be, as you know, something that people refer to as crypto as rails, where people use fiat currencies, but in the background, these move through a centralized or a decentralized clearing mechanism. So instead of, if you send money from South Africa to Nigeria, at the moment it will often go through US dollar, maybe it will go through Bitcoin or Ethereum instead of US dollar. But also that versatility lending itself to having more stable iterations of crypto. So something that's very popular at the moment is something called stablecoins, where a cryptocurrency is linked to a basket of currencies where it includes, you know, US dollar, pounds. It could be a local currency like the rand. Sometimes these baskets include commodities like gold and so on. So there's a lot of possibilities to make this work. So we think all of these things together is going to mean that this new financial system will be created from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And we're already seeing some data to suggest that is the case. So how will it happen? This is a graph that we've showed before, but I think it's important for people to realize, and making the same point as Simon earlier, is that it's not going to happen tomorrow. The existing financial system was built over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this idea of, oh, but why can't we just have everything better with crypto on Monday? It's just not realistic. And so we think this is how we believe the industry will evolve over the next 10 to 20 years. Where we first start in a phase that we call the asset phase, where people do see it to some extent as a store of value or some kind of investment. People speculate on it for sure, but that's where the mindset starts. And sure, in this first phase, people do use it for transactions. We see people use it for remittances, for e-commerce, but it's a very tiny percentage. But what you need is a critical mass of users for the transactional use cases to make sense. So let me give you an example. We worked a while back, many years ago, in fact, 3 or 4 years ago, with a massive online media portal. And we said to them, we built this amazing system that you could go through a paywall and just tap, and if you tapped on the button, it would open whatever Bitcoin wallet you had, and it will make a small micropayment, you'd be through. 2 taps and you're through. And that same could be applied to e-commerce sites and so on. And the media company loved it. They said, wow, this is fantastic. We'll put it on our website as an alternative to, or as an option next to the, doing email or credit card. How many users do you have? And we said we have 20,000 users. They said, ooh, that's a bit of a problem. Please come back when you have 500,000 users. Well, guess what? Now we have 2.5 million users. We haven't gone back to them. We will go back to them. We've been a little bit busy. But the important thing is, out of those 2.5 million people that registered and that started buying cryptocurrency, a very small percentage, if any of them, bought it because they thought they would use it to go through a paywall. A lot of them bought it because they see it as investment, or they were greedy, or they came in through the bubble. But guess what? When that paywall pops up and there's that option to just tap and have a very frictionless experience to go through, some of them are going to tap on that button. Not everyone, but even if the conversion rate on that is 0.1%, that's where you will see the transactions happening. So the point there being is that this asset layer is important to build the infrastructure for what we call the transaction layer, which we will see next. And again, the transaction layer could be Bitcoin, it could be Ethereum, it could be stablecoins. There's a lot of interesting experiments happening with big tech companies and with banks starting to work with stablecoins. We know, you all see the JP Morgan news, but we know other banks across Southeast Asia and Africa that are also working on the stablecoins, and that could really open the doors for transacting. And then the one part I won't talk about now really is the decentralized future, and this is the stuff where people start building non-financial applications. There's a lot of things around decentralized Uber, decentralized Dropbox, where effectively you build systems to eliminate the middleman. We think, I mean, most of the ICOs were in that category. We think it's way too early. Those things are about 10 years away because you still really need cryptocurrency to access those things, and the infrastructure hasn't really been built for enough people to actually access those things. So they will come, but they'll only come much later. So let's quickly talk about the risks. And, it is a new system. It doesn't come without risk. And so we have to acknowledge that. So some of the main ones, there's probably a few others. I can actually think of one I left out here. Nefarious use, which is either money laundering or buying drugs online or so on. Volatility, can it scale? What's the regulation going to be? And education. People don't understand it. How does it work? The one that I've left out here is the one around resources, using energy resources for mining. Is it good for the environment? But let's look at the mitigations that we have in place so far. And I think it's important. This is part of the educational process. If you look at, I'll quickly run through some of those things. But for some of the perceived bad users, just remember that most cryptocurrencies are transparent. And we have data now where we can track and see how much is being used on the darknet, how much is being used for money laundering and so on. We don't have it 100% accurate, but we have a pretty decent idea. And the number is very, very low, both on relative and absolute terms compared to the fiat currency system. And the interesting thing is we have a lot more visibility on what's happening 1, 2, 3 steps removed than the existing financial system has. And it's interesting when we sometimes speak to banks or compliance teams that don't understand this so well. When we can show what happens and something bad happens with crypto, even if it's a very small amount, it's almost like people say, oh, but that now shows why it's bad. But the reality is that most people are using fiat currency for all of these bad things in any case. But the crypto industry is somehow getting penalized for being able to actually see it. Whereas the banks don't actually have to get penalized. They'll go, if someone's buying drugs, $10 of drugs with Bitcoin, they go, oh, there's my point proven. I said, but if he's not buying it with Bitcoin, how do you think he's going to draw it? He's going to draw it from the ATM, and he's going to buy it with cash. And then the person would say to us, oh, but not from our ATM. Then I'll be like, okay, but from whose ATM? No, the other bank's ATM. Okay, so it's not you. Okay, so we can see it. And the tools that we are using to track it is improving and improving and improving. And the stuff that we could do even 1 year ago in terms of tracking the stuff to now is worlds apart. And it's moving very, very fast. Okay, volatility. As you all know, the volatility is a lot less now. The price has been pretty flat. It's interesting, when the Bitcoin price is moving too much, everyone's saying it's too volatile, it's moving too much. And when it's flat, everyone's saying, oh, it's too flat, it should need to go up. So you almost can't please everyone. But the volatility is a lot less. You can use crypto as rails, as I explained. And there's a lot of new innovations like stablecoins that address some of the volatility issues. On the scaling side, we have things like SegWit, Lightning, and ERC20 tokens that actually make it easier to move value and assets around. So that's also being worked on. Already, Bitcoin can scale a lot faster than it could even a year ago. On the regulatory front, there's a lot of work to do, but just remember, most of the good crypto companies self-regulate already. We have a lot better visibility on what's required. In some countries, it's actually been enacted or is about to be enacted. In other countries, the regulators have at least provided comment on when they're going to regulate or the frameworks that are required to work on that. And for example, we'll have probably 6 or 7 licenses by the end of the year in various markets. And then on the educational front, I think the big piece there is to manage expectations. Just again to say, look, a lot of these risks are still there, but we are working on it. It's okay. And they're not so big, and we'll make sure that they don't get out of hand. The press is also another one. The press has been a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's introduced cryptocurrency to everyone, but it also likes to write very dramatic stories about ISIS being funded with Bitcoin and things like that, which is completely untrue. And then just general education. I think this is still a big one. I think what happened was, especially when the price went crazy, last year, people almost forgot that there's a lot, at that time, no one was asking how does it work and why is it important and so on. And a lot of crypto companies actually forgot to help teach their users about these things. And so I think it's something that we're investing a lot into this year to help educate, not just consumers, but also banks and regulators and the press more broadly. But just one last thing to remember here is that all of those mitigations has been largely only been built in the last 5 years. I say plus or minus. It's not 10 years, because when crypto started, most of those things people weren't even thinking about. But that is such a short amount of time. And look how much has actually already been achieved to address those problems. The one on the energy use, by the way, that's a headline you see the whole time. Oh, all the mining is going to, all the mining power that people use, it's bad for the environment and so on. There's a very detailed blog piece that someone wrote. All of that information comes from one blog that one guy in his early 20s wrote that didn't understand energy consumption at all. And that actually a lot of that mining energy is from excess energy that can't be used in China that they use in the mining. So it's actually been debunked completely, but no one wants to hear that story. So I'm not saying we've solved all the problems, but just remember, we need to look not where we are today, but how quickly the mitigations are moving in 5 years. Just imagine where we're going to be in 10 years. In terms of what we're able to do. Much better than what we can do with the existing financial system. So maybe just to kind of wrap that up, I think where do the crypto companies like Luno and many other players fit into this? I think when people think sometimes about crypto companies, this is what they think about, the Wild West, cowboys. And I will tell you something, we are cowboys. But that's not a cowboy, that's a bandit. Okay? There are some bandits as well, and they want to steal people's money. But what does a cowboy do? That's actually what a cowboy is, right? They herd wild horses, they will tame a bull, and so on. And it's important to know we are not trying to push cryptocurrency down people's throat. This is something that is bigger than all of us that's happening. It's like the horse is already bolted, and it's running really fast. And like I said, this stuff is inevitable. Technology revolutions like this, we can't help it. It's just going to happen. So what we are trying to do is just actually tame it in and make it safe and easier for consumers. We're not trying to push anyone to do it. So we're there to help. So just to wrap that up, let's think back to 1996 again when former President Mbeki made that very important speech in 1996. Just out of interest, how many of you at that time owned mobile phones? If you can think. Okay, maybe 5 or 10 people in this room. Okay, so, and for those who own, probably looks something like this. So, this is, the mobile phone penetration rate in Africa at that time was less than 1%. It's probably less than 0.1%. And mobile phones were considered a luxury. Why would anyone use it? You can use a normal phone. No one else is using it, so who can I phone on it? There's only one other person. I remember there was only 2 people that I knew that had mobile phones when I was in 1996. And guess where we are now? There's over 90% penetration rate in Africa, probably closer to 100%. And so the important point here is that when Mr. Mbeki made that speech about Africa, he spoke about a lot of topics like freedom, equality, democracy, human rights, free speech, togetherness, human development. And ironically, the mobile phone probably did more in Africa for all of those things than any government or any policy did. But he didn't see it coming, no one else saw it coming. And if he stood up there and said, I'm standing up here, and for the African Renaissance to happen, everyone's going to have information in their hand, everyone's going to be able to say something, there's going to be transparency, data flowing everywhere, and people would have said, oh, but how many people have a phone? And one person would have put up their hand and everyone would have laughed. So just out of interest, how many of you own Bitcoin or cryptocurrency at the moment? Okay, we are at a blockchain conference, so it's going to be a bit different. Okay, but that's like 80% of the room already. So the point here is a lot can happen in 20 years. And so we honestly believe that working towards and moving towards a common currency or common financial system for Africa is inevitable. The value that's going to be created is absolutely enormous. Most of it's going to go to the consumers. And so the African Renaissance is happening, and cryptocurrency will lead the way from the bottom up. Thank you.